polishing one of Shinta's hand-forged Acantha sleeves. They made in 2 parts, and then they get welded together, so this is one of the parts. So he's hand-hammered them, and they have finishing marks all throughout it. And the process to get it up to a mirror finish is to remove these hammer marks via a process called buffing, surface preparation method, in order to get the high mirror polish that Shinta wants. Because if you're laying down or trying to lay down these hammer marks with dollies, rather than if you're trying to skip the buffing process, you're not going to get very far. The soft dollies are going to go into all of the valleys with the hammer marks. If you imagine the surface is not flat after it's been hammered, it's dimpled. Even though Shinta's been very accurate, precise with his hammer marks, he's left very fine ones towards the end of his planishing to make as level surface as possible within the curvature of the form that he's produced. There's still dimples, so there's valleys in the surface, so they need to be leveled off. You can't do that with soft dollies, stitch dollies or anything like that, because they just flex and they go in. Can't level them off. You need something firmer, so you need to use hard buffs with sand and to level it. When they're much deeper hammer marks, they take longer to level off, and you're still prone to having witnesses of the valleys because they need to be down as much as possible. It's the same with when you've got a spinning and you've got ridges from the spinning lines, impressions of the spinning line, so the tool pushes the metal up the chuck and then it makes these ridges. So if the finer they are, the better finish you're going to get, because it takes less to remove them from the buffing process. And also the buff will stand a better chance at leveling off smaller valleys, smaller height protrusions, rather than big ones. Because there's a certain amount of flex within buffs, even firm ones, where it'll still sink in. And when the valleys and undulations in metal surface are very deep, or ridges for a spinning, it'll naturally want to sink into them. So that's how you can tell a good spinning from a bad spinning, and also good hammering from bad hammering. And you got lots of different other processes within the metalworking trade which will produce superior finishes as to poor ones. And the same applies to stampings. You can get poor stamping or you can get good stamping. Yeah, it applies a lot to hand raising as well, and hand hammering, planishing, such as this. Most people would usually skip out the buffing process because it's not really a utilized thing these days. Most people don't even know about it. It set the standard for quality worldwide, and especially in the country within the cutlery, and Sheffield was renowned for it. But it eventually got thinned down because it became a process that wasn't valued enough, quality wasn't valued enough. Foreign imports were, and they had a lower standard of quality, but they were cheaper because they cut corners and they produced it faster. So in order for English markets to keep up, English firms, they had to cut corners also. And eventually buffing became one of those processes where they just scrapped all together for the most part in most firms, and they introduced different finishing methods or surface preparation methods prior to polishing and finishing. So they would utilize more sisals, so firm coarse dollies with a harsher grit compound, like degreasing compound, in order to remove the marks left from silversmith or the spinning process or hammer process, whatever. But it's limited to your results. You want something polished? Well, do you want it shiny or do you want it polished? There's a big difference there, and most people don't seem to know the difference between what's actually a polished finish on a surface of a piece of metal, or when something's shiny. The big difference is that your lines and all your marks are taken out, and you've gone up through the grades in all of the surface preparation methods, all the way from fabrication of the article to smithing and stuff like that. Whether it be filing or hammering, you're laying down the surface to a certain level or an extent for the next process to follow on from. And it wants to be an ideal level to allow for the best results for that process to do a competent job at removing the previous marks. So if you've got file marks in your work, you're going to want to remove them, and most people these days would use wet and dry or emery sticks, which, you know, whatever does the job. Certain there's a place for it. You know, if you've got something that isn't flat and straightforward, it's hard to access, you need a spindle in there. You need different buffs and felts in different shapes and forms to adapt and stuff like that. And then also, you know, aside from that is preparation for that. So you might have had to pre-buff pieces because they've been made inaccessible through a smithing process and you can't get to them after. A lot of people don't seem to know about that either. That's another thing. Talk about that another day. So getting back to what I was saying, basically your sisaling will only do so much work where you'll have a shiny outcome, but because you've not gone over the previous condition of the surface in an adequate, competent manner, you're gonna leave witnesses of the previous marks because it's gonna follow them. And this is pretty much the same as when you don't cross over lines in order to remove them. If you go with the lines, then you're only gonna drag them out more because whatever you're using to abrade against them is gonna travel into them and dig them out further. So you need to cross them in order to erase them. Keep crossing each time you do a process. So in your filing, you cross them with your buffing marks, and then you go over a finer buffing sand if you want to go to that extent to cross over those rough buffing sand marks, and then, you know, you'll use softer felts from your hard felts, and then after that you'll go into your greasing, which is your first stage of polishing, which will cross over those fine buffing marks, and then once you've done that with your calicos, with your greasing dollies, you'll cross over them with a finer, maybe a finer calico or like a heavy swansdown or something like that, and a finer compound as well. So you cross over them. Each time you're crossing over the lines, getting rid of the previous one. And you get to a final outcome where it's the finest polish you can get, and it'll produce the finest finish, and the finest finish is essentially scratched. It's the very fine lines left from that compound and from that dolly, but they're essentially invisible to the naked eye. You don't see them because they're that fine, and depending on how critical you are at seeing imperfections in metal, some people will be very experienced to the point where they'll know what processes have been skipped out. I don't really think that exists to much extent these days, but back in the day that was a real thing, and they'll have been able to really examine a piece of metal and say they skipped this process. And for the most part, to any layperson, it would look, two examples, one a better finish, and then one, you know, they've skipped a process, they'd look the same, but to that person with that critical eye, they'd be able to tell what the difference was. Unfortunately, we don't have that type of quality control anymore, but it's something that's important, I think, to preserve. Maybe not to the point where it gets, you know, I'm not super critical in that sense, to a point where it's like, you know, come on. But I've seen a lot of poor work where it's not finished and properly, and something that's supposed to be mirror polished is just shiny, and you can see lines everywhere because they've not gone over them, they've left them there. But because it looks shiny to them and they've not got an experienced eye to see these lines and know that they're not supposed to be there necessarily, then they don't see them. And I know because I used to do that myself. I used to not see these things, and I just think it was okay, and it wasn't. It's important to know how to look for these things, these imperfections, and the standard of quality to have a brilliant mirror polish on a piece of silver or article of metalwork or whatever, because there's a standard, and polishing isn't making something shiny, it's a standard. It's like saying a ruler can have centimeters this size or this size, and it's not true. They're just one size, they're a centimeter, and they have a set standard. And it's the same for polishing. Might be a bad example, but that's all I can think of at the top of my head, because it's just polishing is a process and it has a result that you have to follow a procedure in order to attain. So in simple terms, it's not about making something shiny. So it takes, obviously not everyone's going to see this. Most people see something shiny and it's not polished properly, it's just shiny, and then something that is actually mirror polished properly and think, oh, they're both shiny. But so it doesn't really apply to just everyday consumers and lay people. But if you're producing this work and you're taking on the responsibility for setting the standard of quality in this craft and in this trade, that you should abide by these certain standards as well, because if you're not, you're just sort of letting yourself down and letting the quality of your work down as well. Or you can not do that, you can just do whatever you like. That's also an option, but don't be mad if people pick out the imperfections in your work if you've not done it properly, because you should be prepared for that. If you don't care and you're doing it the way you want to do it and it's fine and it's easy and it's good enough, yeah, it's good enough, fine, that's good. But if you're a person who accepts it's good enough, then be prepared for somebody to come up and say that's not good enough. And yeah, so okay, so what's the process to bringing this piece up to a mirror finish? You start off with buffing, and I will buff all of these hammer marks out of the surface using various felts, which are basically the abrasive wheels I use, and they'll range from quite a firm, hard buff to start off with to level off the surface and lay down any valleys, the hammer marks, to make it nice and level and smooth. Using it's like a medium grit sand, it's your basic buffing sand, which is known as Frio N, and it's about, I don't know actually, it's probably about 120, maybe 240, I can't remember. It produces quite a nice finish. You can grease, you can start polishing straight from that if you like, but some people like to go from that to a finer sand, and it's just a bit easier to go to your polishing stages without taking out so many buffing lines and produce a nicer finish as well overall. So it depends what type of job you're doing, whether it's finer silverware or maybe you're just doing something made out of brass or plate. You might not need to take the full extent of finishing it in those many processes. Some processes you can take shortcuts to, as long as you get the competent level of surface finish result that you need for that article of work. So for example, something plated, i.e. made out of brass, nickel or copper, because it's a cheaper article, it might be made faster as well. You might not need to do as good a finish as you would do with your silver, because at the end of the day they're paying for the process to be done, and you can't economize, or you might not be able to economize for the amount of processes and time that it takes to produce that finish. So it's not necessary. It's the finish you'll get by removing a step will be good enough for that. But in this case, I'm going to use a finer sand after this one, just so I can, which is called fining off that process. And basically I'm going to cross over my previous the initial buffing lines, which I used to take out the hammer marks. I'm going to cross over them with a finer sand, so the lines will be finer, the surface will be more level, because essentially it's a level surface but it's got tiny scratches in. But then when I cross over it, it's going to be a level surface with finer scratches in, even more tinier scratches. So if you, in other words, if you magnify the surface, it'll be like this. Yeah. Whereas you can imagine if you've got something, and those will be coarse lines, let's say, but if you've got fine lines, they'll be very close together, making the surface more level. So it's easier for a dolly to cross over it and won't lay track lines or anything like that. won't be prone to track lines and stuff when you bring it up to a polish. Because all the dollies do is go in with any values that are left. So the buffing process needs to eliminate every chance of that from happening. So when I use the finer sand, I'll use softer buffs as well. The felts will be a less dense felt. They'll be very soft and form-fitting. They'll abide to the form of what I'm putting under it, what they're abrading against, and they'll finish it very evenly, which will be very suitable for this because it's a very round and curvy form, which will lend itself really good. All the buffs will shape themselves and lend themselves really good to keeping this form nice and even and allowing the light to flow nicely around it. Thing is with finishing stuff where you might have light and you can see a dimple or a valley. If you see a light streak go down the metal, you can see the warble in it like that, and that shows when you've got a dip or a valley or anything like that. So that's another thing we need to eliminate, and by getting rid of the hammer marks, we're essentially eliminating that because we're leveling the surface off completely, but there's still chances that maybe the form where it's curved has a ridge or something like that, so we might need to just even that out where it just flows very nice and smoothly. Yeah, and another thing is try and avoid plating this because the amount of problems that you can have from silver plating stuff is much greater than just not having to plate it. Putting in the work just to get rid of all the fire stain these days is much better, I think, because there's little places that'll do silver plating these days, do it for when you want it or when you need it, and then the results vary as well because plating seems to be a complicated process. I don't know much about plating. I know the scientific factors of it. I've read a book about it. I've done it in practice, but I've never set anything up where I know all the chemical formulas and everything, whatever. Basically, I've had plating come out where it's got little speckles on it. Plating sometimes gets burnt if the voltage is too high. If the tank's not clean, it's contaminated, you can have streaks on it, or plating can be dull, and essentially you need to just strip it off and have it replated if anything goes wrong. Even if it goes right, and 9 times out of 10 you're probably going to have streak marks on it anyway, you need to refinish it once it's been plated because there's always some stuff on it like a film or a streak or something where you just need to refinish it. And for this article, it's going to be joined together at the end by welding, and it'll be virtually inaccessible with a spindle, the processes me and Ben are using in order to bring us up to a mirror polish. So plating is just out of the question. The aim is to get rid of all the fire stain from this piece in order to bring it up to a mirror polish and have it natural, clean, sterling silver finish. And then by welding it, it'll localize the heat and keep the fire stain in the localized area where it'll be easier to clean off as and when. Hopefully, we'll see. So as you can see, there's lots of little hammer mark. It's very level, it's good hammering, but it's all dimpled. Obviously for a surface that wants to be mirror polished, you can't mirror polish that. You can get a polish on it and make it shiny for a hammered surface, but you can't get a standard mirror polish. Mirror polish is a set standard finish where it is level and polished to the best extent possible. And the very best finishes are, no matter which way you look at a piece of silver in any light, at any angle, you will never see any lines in any direction. That is when you know you've got the best mirror polish. Very hard to do anyway, only for the super duper critical eye type of people that'll want that, but it's always good to aim high. You don't want to have a subpar polish because that's like the old saying, can't polish a turd. So yeah, I've seen that a few times. Yeah, never looks good. It's never good. Alright, so This is the felt I use to, for the most part, for these pieces. I start off with this felt. Wrong way. There we go. It's quite firm. A little bit give in it, but it's pretty firm. And it's shaped like a conical shape, so it's got a nose on it that's narrowish, and that'll allow me to get into, you know, narrow like curves and stuff within this form. And also it has it widens out to get to larger curves, so it's quite an adaptable shaped buff suitable for this. So it's like a nominal sort of good all-around buff to get into most parts of this piece. Over use, it has actually developed a dip in the center, which is not really good practice when you are buffing and using felts. You don't want to aim for that when you want to keep a nice level buff. But in this case, it works quite good for the purpose, because it will conform to the curvature of these wide areas here and roll over it nicely with that concave there. So that's okay, I don't mind that. But generally, if you're using like a flatter buff like that, like a body buff or something, you'll want that. It's not necessarily flat, you'll want it slightly convex, because all these buffs have got flex in them, and when it compresses, it'll go down nice and level. So you don't want sharp corners, because they'll all dig in when it presses in. So you want it quite rounded off like that. But obviously, if you're doing something flat and then you've got a dip in it, like this one has developed through use, you will mess up your flat surface, what you're trying to attain, and you'll put waves in it. You'll essentially, what we call well it. You'll put wells in the piece of metal, and it'll look a mess. And you'll have a job at getting them out. So that's buffing maintenance a little bit there for you. This one as well, I've also got little cut lines in. You can't really see them because they've sort of closed up. But basically, I've gotten a hacksaw and cut lines on this buff, and what they do is they come in handy for buffs such as these, you'd call these insiders. So they are felts that you use for going inside jobs, hence the name. And the channels that you cut into them make basically a better key for the sand to go in. The sand gets stuck in the channels, and then helps the buff have a key of sand going around it more than if it was just smooth. And so they push more sand onto the working surface of the metal and just allow for more sand to be there. They work pretty effectively, so I do them for most insiders that I have, that are firm ones. Yep, so we start off with that one, and then we change to maybe more narrower pointed conical insiders for getting into like bits that I can't do. So I'll save all the bits at the end for like all the corners, which I might not be able to get into with this one because either the tip of the nose is too wide, or any other reason. So this one might be better to get into this point here. Then, you know, might use like a little roller insider sort of thing like that to get into a tighter radius. And then various other ones, you know, maybe like a facing off buff. So with these types, you use the front of the buff, the face. So that's why it's called the facing off one. And then, you know, that might help where I can't get a felt onto it the conventional way, I suppose. So I would need to access it this way. If you can see that the piece is got a million different things around it, so it's probably covering it up. Hence the use for these to access bits that you can't normally get to. There's another one, like a mushroom shape. Use the face of it to get onto the piece, which you might not be able to get to that way on a spindle because something is blocking it. Ah! There you go, that's it. So, let's begin. Got a little guard here, which is made of cardboard. That's just cut now. This one is cut to the width of the buff because any bigger and it's going to get in the way of the piece because this piece has overarching features. So if it was wider, you normally use a wider one, it would just get in the way and be a hassle. So that's there for when I need it, but for the most part I'd have it out of the way because I need free access of the spindle in order to buff it properly. Yep, that's it. Okay, alright, so I'm going to use this felt with my buffing sand, which is the 3ON stuff, typical roughing sand, like medium grit, and I'm going to level all the hammer marks off this piece. So if I just dry buff this section without any sand on it, it will show you the existing hammer marks a bit better if it focuses. There, you can see this section here. I don't know if it's in focus, but you can see the light and it's very ripply on the surface. That is all the hammer marks shining. So we need to get this surface leveled down so that when that light shines on it, it's very smooth. There's none of that. So I'll just pick any section really. Usually I like to pick the hardest first because then the easiest is the last, which in this case is usually this bit is the hardest bit. It's getting all of that. It takes a bit more work. So start here and want to hold the piece in a safest way possible because it is an extremely dangerous piece to hold. You've got so many points on here that can get caught or snagged, and even holding this hurts your fingers because it can stab or protrude into your skin, and if it gets caught you can have a nasty accident. So it's best to always be aware of what you're doing when working on a spindle, going at a high velocity and high horsepower, whilst at the same time with a ridiculously hazardous piece. So always mind where you're holding it, where your fingers are, where your spindle is, everything. Never stop thinking about it. Never lull yourself by, you've not had an accident, you're used to it, it's all good, I'm fine now, I'm competent. That's how it'll get you. So always be aware of it because it can happen at any point and you won't know about it until it's already happened, which will be too late. So here we go. Alright, I'm going to start on this bit first, I guess. I like to do the leaves, kind of make my way around the leaves each section and then kind of blend in the middle sections. So get straight onto the sand, it's alright. Sometimes I need that guard away as well because I can't see properly what I'm doing and I need full access because, again, this is a dangerous piece and I don't want to get it, I don't want to not be able to see it, get caught and then get yanked. So that's why I don't have the guard. I'd rather be sprayed in the face with a bit of sand than to be hit in the face with a large spiky metal object. Right, so I've just been buffing that now. I've done a few strokes on that. I'll wipe the sand away and I'll just give it a dry buff so you can see. There we go. So you can, I don't know, can you see? Right, it's hard to get it into a position, but if you, that stupid thing there, right, if you can see, the hammer marks are there, and then where I've concentrated the buff up here, it's all nice and smooth now. And that is what we want all over. That's the result we want on all over this piece, both sides. So that's pretty much it. What you're wanting to do, or what I'm wanting to do with this, is when buffing, the lines will follow and drag. So, for example, this piece has got points on it, and the points have corners, and if I'm buffing that way, it'll go along this line and drag it over the surface and make a track line on the surface, because the sand will dig into anything that it crosses. So the best method to buff something like this is to go away from it, go along the points and away from the surface, and that is how you do it properly without getting track lines in. Sometimes at some stages of this piece I do have to do it that way, but I will be mindful about it and try and get it at an angle where I can easily cross over them, or where it won't leave a severe track mark as it would do going completely in line with it, and then I can cross over those lines with another dolly or something like that. Also, another thing to point out is if you're doing buffing that way with the edge coming up to the buff, there is much more higher chance of it snagging and getting caught and flicking out like that. So that'll make you jump if that happens. So that's why you generally buff stuff off the edge like that. If you're doing flat things, that's fine, but just be mindful about it, you know, getting caught on that edge there, like that. It can snag that way. So watch out for that. Anyways, carry on. So I just load up with sand in my hand, and I've got the piece propped up in a way that I can hold it, and if it gets yanked out, it can go out of my hand quite freely, hopefully. And I've got it up. Obviously I'll need to put a certain amount of pressure on this point because it's just a piece of loose metal flexing on air. I'll need to get my hand up underneath it and push it against the felt. So when I've got the sand in my hand, I'm essentially putting it under the metal and then loading it up and then creating that abrasion on the felt and then putting pressure on. And I'm doing that in a way where I'm keeping the felt on the metal balanced and level, and I'm not wanting to go over that edge and round it off or get one area more than the other, because that'll create a well and I'll get an uneven surface and a dip because I've concentrated too much on one area over the whole majority of it. And that's something that can happen a lot with any type of spindle work and finishing. I've seen that with people where they don't go over the whole piece, they go over it in bits, and it creates wells all over the piece and it looks a mess. Obviously they don't see it because in a certain light you can't see them as good, but then when it's brought up to a really good polish, you can see it all and it looks horrible. So don't do that. But that takes a bit of practice, obviously. You need to learn what that looks like. So the best way to do that is by doing it and seeing what it looks like, because then you'll know what a bad result is and how to avoid that, what not to do and how to correct it. All these things that are important in making you a better craftsman at whatever it is that you do. and it applies to many things in life as well, outside of your craft, if you like to utilise it in that way as well. So this is a point here, I'm kind of going slow just for the video's sake, but this is a point here where I can use like the nose of the buff, the felt, and just kind of go in, do it along the form of this and make sure it goes in there nicely. It's fits the form of the piece very well, and I know that I'll be able to blend that in very nicely on either side of the buffing marks, in order to make a nice smooth transition from there to there, instead of putting like a dip in, because I've used the wrong size buff. It's like been a smaller diameter for the diameter of curvature it is, so then it's made like a dip. You want it to conform the best possible way, and the best way is to use the best fitting buff diameter for whatever curve you've got. In other words, the closest fit you can get possible, you're going to get the best level of surface. Sometimes that's not always possible, so you'll find ways around that and do your best to get the result that you need. But that's again just the thing that you need to learn how to do and adapt to doing in order to achieve that. So we got to a point where I needed to change to a little roller type inside a buff, because there is a bit here where it's just quite a tight curve, radius, whatever, and I need something a bit more smaller to access into it and more even within the buff diameter, not conical or anything like that, David. And I've just basically got over it on this section here, and now I need to get up into here, but in order to do that I've got to do one of these thingies and bring it over the spindle like that. And that's, ooh, look at that, that's a good one. So whenever you're doing things like this, always be mindful of the piece over the spindle. Obviously use a reduced spindle for this type of work, and basically I just chuck sand onto the piece. I don't need to load it in with my hand because it can offer itself onto there, and essentially I can make the most of that platform and offer it up, and there we go. And the sounds you are hearing are the edges of the metal just coming in contact with the spindle a little bit. That's fine, all the edges will be finished afterwards anyway, so it doesn't matter if they get marked via the spindle process here. And it's just very carefully watch what you're doing, where your hands are, all the way nice and evenly, and I can brush it off my finger like that, and then I can see any hammer marks on it. There's hammer marks there, and it's pretty clean. It all goes there where it blends into the hammer marks, and then I need to keep going up here and work my way up. So there's that.
This is a good one, isn't it? So, yeah, you just need to be careful when you're doing stuff like this. Obviously, when you're taking it off the spindle and then loading onto the spindle, you've got to make sure your work is clear of that and not going to get snagged, pulled, and you've got a grip on it where you can hold it firmly, but at the same time you can lose it and let go if you need to, if it gets dragged away.